So if you're sitting comfortably, as they used to say, we can now begin. The Siege of Gloucester occurred during the second year of the 17th century Civil War, when the small parliamentarian garrison at Gloucester held out for 26 days against the superior royalist forces of Charles I. It was an important turning point in the Civil War. In today's democratically elected parliament, the practice is for one political party, or maybe a coalition with other parties, forms a government, puts forward their policies, which the opposition parties challenge, but then the matters are put to a discussion and a majority vote in order to come into law. In 17th century England, Charles I had inherited from his father James the belief that he was king by divine right, and Parliament was there to rubber stamp his decrees. He had dissolved Parliament for 11 years until he wanted money to put down an uprising in Scotland and then get involved in the 30 Years' War overseas. Now, he also wanted to raise a ship tax, whereby every town in the country would raise money to build a warship. Tewkesbury was included in that as well, as you may know. Parliament were not happy about this, or the fact that he had married a Catholic, because they were afraid that England would be returned to Catholicism. Matters came to a head when the king sent troops to arrest the parliamentarians, or some of them. He declared war on Parliament, issued a proclamation to inform the country, and raised his standard in Nottingham in August 1642. The people were divided in their allegiance. The high church, nobility, and the peasantry who served the nobility took the side of the king as royalists. Puritans, the middle classes, and tradesmen were on the side of the parliamentarians. Initially, things went the king's way. From his headquarters in Oxford, he directed a number of battles around the country. He gained control of the northeast, Wales, and much of the West Country. In February 1643, he took Worcester, Cirencester, and in July, Bristol. Now, Gloucester has always been an important place due to its vital position at the lowest crossing point of the River Severn into Wales. The Romans formed a garrison there in 48 AD in their move to subdue the Welsh, and in the 17th century, Charles needed access to Wales, where he was recruiting soldiers for his army. By 1643, only Gloucester remained parliamentarian between Bristol and Lancashire. Speed's map of 1610 shows the extent of the city of Gloucester and its proximity to the River Severn. It has narrow streets, wooden houses, a high cross at the centre with a fresh water supply coming to pipe down from Robinswood Hill. There were stone walls and 7 gates into the city. Population was around 5,000. The council were mainly Puritans. They were unhappy about the ship tax and the king selling the Forest of Dean to the Catholic Sir John Winter. In London, the parliamentarians recognised the fragility of Gloucester and sent 1,500 troops under a 23-year-old Colonel Edward Massey to form a garrison. They were housed in the Wheat Market in Southgate Street and in private houses. Massey set about reinforcing the defences in preparation for an attack. The walls were reinforced, ditches dug, guns and ammunition stored. The 7 gates into the city were locked at night, the mayor holding the key. This slide shows the location of the city at that time in relation to the city of today. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, a nephew of Charles I, took Cirencester for the king in February of 1643. He then sent an ultimatum to Gloucester. Massey, it is said, refused to surrender to a foreign prince. First, let's look at a lesser-known battle that took place before the siege. Now, if you travel along the D4215 road from Gloucester to Newent, when you get to Rudford, you will pass on the right near Barber's Bridge what you might assume is a war memorial. Well, it is a war memorial, but not from either World War I or World War II. It marks the burial spot of Welsh soldiers who, it is assumed, perished at the Battle of Hynham in March 1643. The bodies were discovered by workmen in the 19th century, and the memorial was erected in 1871 using stones from the ancient walls of Gloucester. In February of that year, that's 1643, Lord Herbert of Raglan Castle raised an army of 2,000 Welshmen to support the king in readiness for his expected assault on Gloucester. They camped just outside the city at Luddenham Hill. This is near the present Hynham House and Holy Innocents Church, wasn't there at the time, of course. Herbert's men dug in for a month, ready for the attack on Gloucester from the west when needed. Massey, of course, was very aware of their presence and set up a forward outpost on the west bank of the River Severn at Over in order to launch a preemptive attack on them. At that time, Lord Herbert had gone to Oxford to consult with the king, and he left behind a rather weak command structure. Massey and Sir William Waller, the parliamentarian commander in the southwest, then hatched a cunning plan. Waller came up from Malmesbury via Cirencester. He was given the impression to the royalists that he was going to Cirencester and to retake that because the royalists had taken that in the February. He brought with him he crossed the River Severn with 1,500 men at Framelode on a Bailey bridge of boats and came up to Huntly. It's possible then that he split his forces into two. Having lost my page, I'll just find it. Okay, he might have split his force into two, some going via Rudford on the peak of that triangle there, and others directly to Hynham, both coming up behind the Welsh at Hynham. Massey then brought his troops out from the outpost to Over. Thus, the Welsh were surrounded. There was a brief battle over a couple of days. Some of the Welsh were killed, but most, some 1,600 men, surrendered. The exact details of what happened are uncertain, as several accounts from both sides differed in the detail. But it is possible that some escaped up the B4215, but were caught and killed at Barber's Bridge, where their bodies were buried. That would be a solution. There are other solutions as well, but I'll leave you to investigate themselves if you want to. Massey now had a problem. Let's just do some maths. Population of Gloucester, 5,000. Massey's men, 1,500. And now another 1,600 prisoners, greatly increasing the population of a city preparing for an attack. Initially, the prisoners were held in St Mary le Lode Church, where they were fed cabbage leaves because they were running out of food. Massey's solution was to offer them a free pardon as long as they agreed not to fight for the king again. Most accepted the offer and went home. Whether they kept to the agreement or not is doubtful. The siege. In July 1643, Bristol was taken by the Royalists. It was a bloody battle with many killed. In August, the king then brought his 30,000 men up to Gloucester and laid siege to the city. The king's troops were stationed at the foot of Robbinswood Hill in an area called Tredworth Field, probably on the site of the present Old Gloucester Cemetery, as shown in this slide. Charles himself and his family stayed at Matson House on the east side of Robbinswood Hill. Matson House, of course, still exists. It was formerly Selwyn Girls' School and now is a care home for disabled young people. We know that both sons, Charles, aged 13, and James, aged 10, were also there. Interestingly, these photos show his three children, Charles and James, to become future kings of England, and Mary, whose son will become William III. Incidentally, the little girl in between the two there, I can just point there with my pointer, I think, is actually James. They used to dress them up in girls' clothes when boys were very young. Strange practice I can't see happening today. Although Charles' forces greatly outnumbered the parliamentary garrison, he didn't immediately attack. Gloucester was well protected thanks to massive preparation, including the burning of houses in the suburbs outside the city wall to give the royalists nowhere to be concealed. Following the numbers killed at Bristol, the king was probably a bit reluctant to lose more of his subjects in a massacre, so he tried negotiation. These pictures show two possible depictions of the negotiations taking place, but I think it's most unlikely that the more famous painting of a meeting at the top of Robbinswood Hill at the bottom of your screen, now kept in Gloucester Museum, it's very doubtful that that ever took place. On Thursday, August the 10th, the king issued a proclamation to the citizens, giving them a 2-hour ultimatum to surrender. This ultimatum was not actually shared with the ordinary citizens, but was discussed at some length by the city fathers in the Tolsey. Now, the Tolsey was a city council offices. The slide shows the location of the Tolsey at the cross. On the left-hand side, that's what it was, but that actually is newer than the original. That's a replacement built in 1751. So I haven't got a picture or a diagram of the original Tolsey. But on the right, then you've got the cross now, and that's the location of the Tolsey. The deadline came and went as they considered their response. The mayor, in particular, was uneasy because of his oath to the king. But after 4 hours, a reply was prepared and delivered. And let's read it to you. We, the inhabitants, magistrates, officers, and soldiers within the garrison of Gloucester, unto His Majesty's gracious message, return this humble answer: that we do keep this city according to our oaths and allegiances to and for the use of His Majesty and his royal posterity, and do accordingly conceive ourselves wholly bound to obey the commands of His Majesty. Wait a minute, you say. It sounds as if they're surrendering. But wait, look at the rest of the message. Signified by both houses of Parliament, and are resolved by God's help to keep this city accordingly. The siege was on. Now, there are many books and articles describing the siege, but the most reliable source of the ensuing action was recorded by John Dorney, the town clerk, who kept a day-by-day journal, which can be found on the internet in its original 17th century English, but is also translated, as shown here, into modern English, if you want to read it. Very interesting. Now, let's just have a look at the King's men. Prince Rupert was in favour of launching an immediate attack with his cavalry, which would have been unlikely to succeed against the strong defences. Had he succeeded, there would have been a massacre. His cavalry were then deployed in the north, to the north of the city, where the ground was boggy and difficult for horses. The main action was against the length of wall between the east and south gates. Royalist cannon were set up in Gawdy Green, which is present-day Brunswick Square down near the park. The main aim was to batter the walls and mine under the east gate. Musketeers were employed to take pot shots at anyone looking over the walls. Sadly, 2 children were killed in this way. Fresh water from Robbinswood Hill and the River Twyver was diverted, thus depriving the citizens with water for drinking and driving their mills and washing. In many ways, people in a well-defended city under siege have the upper hand. Apart from firing at any royalist soldier who broke cover, and came in their line of fire, Massey sent men out at night to take the besiegers by surprise, killing some, spiking their cannons, and stealing their shovels, which were being used to mine under the walls. On the other hand, those besieging the city had to break through the defences. Walls were thick and banked up where necessary with earth. A moat ran in front of the walls. The main approach was to batter a breach into the walls or dig underneath them. The river in the east was a major barrier, and the boggy ground on the northwest was unsuitable for attack. Many more royalists were killed than soldiers in the city. This picture here shows where the wall was, and just that tree right in the centre of the picture was the corner, the southeast corner. Gawdy Green going over beyond there, so cannons would be fired in this direction. St Mary de Crypt Church, excuse me, St Mary de Crypt Church was used as an explosive factory and ammunition store. The crypt was a timber store. The church was therefore a target for the cannon fire. But apart from some cannonball damage still visible in the east walls of the church, apparently it was largely unsuccessful. However, the old Greyfriars building was in the line of fire and received considerable damage. The south gate came under a lot of fire and suffered heavy damage. The citizens banked it up with earth on the inside to save it collapsing. A Dr. Chillingworth designed a siege engine along the lines used by the Romans, as seen in this picture. The idea was to make a transportable structure to provide cover for the besiegers, which would tip over in the moat, enabling access to the walls for the attacking soldiers. It is said that one was nearly completed when the siege ended, and it is also claimed to have given rise to the nurse's rhyme Humpty Dumpty, which you will all be familiar with. Personally, my belief in this myth was shattered on a visit to Colchester, where I was told a similar story, and they claimed the rhyme as their own for their own siege by the Romans. In Gloucester, though, we have our own version of the rhyme, and it goes like this. Humpty Dumpty fell in the beck, with all his sinews round his neck. All the king's soldiers and all the king's surgeons and all the king's knights couldn't put Humpty Dumpty to right. The besiegers fired mortars over the walls, which burst into flame on landing, in the hope that they would fall on property and set it alight. Dorney tells of one mortar that fell in the street, and a woman rushed out and poured water on it to put the flames out before any damage could be done. Another story was an event in Westgate Street, the home of James Commerline, an apothecary who was sitting in his house, this house here, when a mortar came in through the wall, and it took many pails of water to quench the flames. He was a Dutchman who had come to Gloucester to escape war at home. You could say, out of the frying pan into the fire. Excuse me while I just have a sip of this coffee. My throat's a bit dry. Now let's look at some of the prominent characters involved in the siege. We've already met Colonel Edward Massey, who was appointed governor of the city and was the military mastermind behind its defence. Only 23 years old, he had already fought for the king in Holland, but he was not offered a commission back when he returned back to England, so he looked to the parliamentarians. He did have Puritan leanings, but was actually a professional soldier, prepared to fight for anyone who paid him, assumedly. After the siege, he switched sides back to the Royalists and was knighted by Charles II. Later became an MP for Gloucester and was offered the post of ambassador of Jamaica, but he did not actually take that up. The mayor and aldermen were Puritans. One of the most influential was one Thomas Purey. At one time, he was the mayor and MP for Gloucester. During the siege, he was a captain under Massey. On the Royalist side, then we have King Charles I. It is said that he was personally courageous but stubborn and a poor leader of men. After his defeat in the Civil War, he was executed on order of the Parliament in 1649. Prince Rupert of the Rhine was a nephew of King Charles. He was born in Prague, an excellent leader of cavalry, but rather arrogant and austere with very few close friends. And then finally we have the Earl of Forth. He was a 70-year-old Scotsman and as Captain General was technically in control of the besieging forces. There's no evidence as to where Massey's headquarters were in Gloucester, but he did lodge at the Crown Inn in Lower Westgate Street. Dorney tells of a cannonball fired from Anthony Prior, hitting the inn and landing in the bolster of a bed, not Massey's bed, I understand. No one, fortunately, was injured. Another hit the 200-foot spire of the nearby St Nicholas Church, doing some damage. It was repaired, but many years later it was shortened to its present height for safety reasons. Much of the action took place at the East Gate. The Royalists employed miners from the Forest of Dean who attempted to tunnel under the gate. You've probably passed this and looked down and you can see some remains of the wall and one side of the tower, one side of the gate. You can go down underneath at certain times, underneath boots. The defenders, the Royalists employed miners from the Forest of Dean who attempted to tunnel under the gate. The defenders reciprocated by tunnelling above them and the tunnel below became flooded. Towards the end of the siege, the gate was in danger of collapse and earth was banked up on the city side, which did, fortunately, hold its place. On the 24th of August, 2 lawyers arrived at the North Gate. Both of them were called William, as it happened. One was William Bell from Sandhurst, and the other, William Hill, was the town clerk of Tewkesbury. They were sent by the king, and at that time, of course, after Waller had seen them off, after the Battle of Hynham, it had gone back to Royalists. So the Royalists sent them to surrender, or to negotiate a surrender. Massey wasn't interested. There had been other attempts to persuade the city to submit, but this one, like them, was dismissed out of hand. Unbeknown at that time, the Earl of Essex, the overall commander of the Parliamentary army, was raising a band in London to come to the aid of Gloucester. 10,000 soldiers had actually set out the day before the lawyers arrived, and for the march, set out the day before on a march to relieve the city. Now, they could not come the direct route via Oxford, as that city was held by the Royalists, so they took a more northerly route by Stow-on-the-Wold, where Prince Rupert's cavalry went out to challenge them, but they failed to stop them. Gloucester Cathedral had fortunately been spared from earlier plans of ardent Puritans to pull it down. Now with its tall tower, it was an ideal lookout place to keep an eye on the surrounding countryside and any movement of Royalist troops. Massey ordered a beacon to be prepared on nearby Wainload's Hill and lit if any relieving forces were sighted. This would then be seen by lookouts atop the cathedral tower. Before the siege, Massey had given the citizens the option of leaving the city as the threat of attack increased. Some did this, but some Royalist sympathisers remained. The mace bearer and 3 or 4 others were in this number and climbed the tower with a gun and took a pot shot at Massey as he passed below. The shot missed and the offenders were apprehended. It amazes me that anybody would seek to shoot somebody from a tower where they had very little means of escape. And they didn't escape. They were caught, the leader was hanged, and the poor mace bearer had his fingers chopped off. On the 5th of September, the relief troops were spotted coming over Cleeve Hill. The beacon was lit, and the news quickly spread around the city. This, of course, was also reported to the king, and he decided to abandon the siege and head off to Newbury for his next battle. The siege had lasted for 26 days. The 1,500 soldiers in the garrison, and, of course, the citizens of Gloucester had held out against the king's 30,000 royalists. A few more days might well have seen the defences breached, and there were only 3 barrels of gunpowder left. It was that close. Only 50 parliamentarians were killed, but over 1,000 royalists. The aftermath. During the siege, of course, the churches were full with people praying for relief. And when the South Gate was rebuilt, the following was written on the inside of the gate: "A city assaulted by man, but saved by God." And on the outside of the gate, "Ever remember the 5th of September 1643, give God the glory." In recent years, Gloucester Day has been resurrected by Alan Meyer, our town crier, on the nearest Sunday to the 5th of September to start our annual Gloucester History Festival, when there is a memorial service held and a parade through the city. As you are no doubt aware, the Civil War resulted in the defeat of the Royalists, the execution of Charles, and the exile of his family. The country became a Puritan Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. On his death, his son Richard Cromwell took over, but proved unpopular and ineffective, so Charles' son was brought back from France, and the monarchy restored in 1660. Remember that the new king, Charles II, was present in Gloucester as a young lad during the siege and saw the humiliation of his father. To exact his revenge on the city, he ordered all the defences to be taken down, which explains why there are only a few remnants of the walls now remaining. When I visit Chester, I'm dead jealous of the walls they have. You can walk all the way around. Unfortunately, in Gloucester, for that reason I've explained, we hardly have anything to show. So a statue, of course, eventually the citizens felt they should honour the king, the new king. This statue of Charles II was erected at the Wheat Market in Southgate Street in 1662. In 1780, it was removed to Chaxhill, Westbury-on-Severn, when the market was dismantled, and in 1960 was returned, rather worse for wear, to Gloucester, and it was placed in a fairly obscure place off Three Cocks Lane. And if you know that, you've probably never seen this, because you have to go down a little lane and turn left by some council flats, and at the end, there's poor old Charles II. The motto on Gloucester City's coat of arms was adopted after the siege. In Latin, it states, "Fides invicta triumphat," which translated into English, "Unconquered faith triumphs." Now, what are the conclusions? The Siege of Gloucester was a significant turning point in the Civil War. It was going the king's way prior to 1643, and then from there on began to lose ground. Some of his reluctance to take Gloucester by storm may have been due to lack of ammunition. And without Parliament's approval of funds he had little money to purchase it from the continent. Some question whether he ever really intended to take Gloucester, that his real aim was to get back to London, and threatening Gloucester did bring Essex out of London, leaving Charles to head east in that direction. Unfortunately for him, his next battle was at Newbury, and it didn't go well for him either, and he never made it to London. The siege cost Gloucester dearly. It took many years to rebuild and recover loss of revenue, with little help from the government. And finally, here's what we can learn from history. Wars are terrible things. Civil war was the worst kind, where families are split and lifelong friends find themselves on opposite sides. Fortunately, we haven't had a civil war in this country since then. This letter from Sir William Waller, who we already met, to his royalist friend, Sir Ralph Hopton, sadly sums up the sad situation. That great God, which is a searcher of my heart, knows with what a sad sense I go upon this service, and with what a perfect hatred I detest this war without an enemy. But I look upon it as a sent from God, and that is enough to silence all passion in me. We are both upon the stage, and must act such parts as are assigned to us in this tragedy. Let us do it in a way of honour and without personal animosities. Thank you for listening.